Well, welcome, friends and fans, to The Artist's Voice. This is Jerry Hardesty, the host and producer of the show. As many of you already know, I launched the podcast in 2018 to empower artists to tell their stories and talk about their work. All genres are welcome, as well as domestic and international artists. This interview is being broadcast live via StreamYard to Facebook. When complete, a video will be available. You may also listen to the final show on most podcast platforms. And finally, you may also access it and other interviews that have occurred on the show on the website. There's on the show's website, at www.theartistvoice.info. Please consider giving a small donation to support the podcast, as well as an upcoming exhibition of artwork by many of the guest artists from the show. And by the way, this will be the second time that we've had a virtual show for the Artist's Voice. The first time was a couple of years ago, and we had about 30 artists participate. Hopefully we'll have that many again. So that will be a virtual show called Diverse Voices 2. So anyway, for a small donation, go to Patreon and search on sponsorships. There are many gifts contributed by podcast guests themselves, as well as me, for you to choose as a thank you for your donations. Today, my guest is Anna Novakov, who is also one of the patrons of the show. Anna is a former art history professor and one who has reinvented herself as a very successful businesswoman. As a Serbian American, she has been in the United States since early childhood. Welcome, Anna, to the show.
Thank you, Jerry. It's nice to be here.
It's my pleasure having you. I've not had a designer before, so I'm excited to have you on the show as a designer and as one of the many hats you wear as a professional woman. So you're quite prolific and a very creative businesswoman. As I stated, you were an art history professor for 20 years, and now you label yourself as an artist, a designer, a writer, and a certified perfumer, not to mention a successful businesswoman. So has it been difficult for you, Anna, to transition among these various creative projects?
I wouldn't say it was difficult, but it was and is a challenge, which is something that I always like. And I've always been a type of person that had to do a bunch of things at the same time. And so thinking about the creative process for me, it's just this kind of basic form. So whether it's writing or it's design or it's creating artwork or doing, curating exhibitions, for me, they're all kind of part of the same process. So you make something, you create something based on whatever idea you originally had. And then the medium comes afterwards. Like, what would be the best way to fit this in? So in a lot of ways, for me, it's something that if you do one thing, it leads to another thing. So you never know what direction that's going to go. And that's tremendously satisfying and tremendously fun.
Yes. And I can relate to all that you just said there, because I always have way too many things going on the same time. Obviously, I'm an artist myself. And of course, then I have this podcast. I host and produce this podcast, which is challenging in and of itself. And I always have some kind of a learning curve associated with everything that I do, which was just time consuming. And then of course there's marketing, which I hate, and you can possibly relate to that as well. But oh, by the way, I have to say, you're my 100th episode.
Yay!
Yay! I should be further along, but
congratulations.
Well, thank you, and thanks for being my 100th guest. So it's pretty
That's
awesome.
very cool. That's a lot of guests.
It is. However, that's over 3 years, going on 4, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's, if you look at it in relative to the time, it's not that many. But I find it very interesting talking with guests from all over the world, and from all creative genres, and I've learned so much, so much, and so I'm anxious to see what I'm going to learn from you. Maybe you give me some tips on marketing. So, Anna, which of your creative processes takes priority?
That's a difficult question, actually, because I'm a morning person. I end up working first. Whatever the first idea I get in the morning is the one that I take off with that day. So, for example, this morning I started doing some textile designs early, like at 6:30 in the morning. So that became the interest of the morning. Writing projects usually happen later in the afternoon. It kind of has to go with the cycle of how my brain works or how things, what one thing leads to another. But I think in terms of prioritization now, probably the visual work. I just joined a gallery in Chelsea called Pleiades, which is an artist-run gallery that's been around since 1977. And they have a beautiful new space on 27th Street near 11th Avenue in Chelsea. So I started working with them as of last month. And it's been fantastic first meeting all of these artists that are part of it. There's about 14, 15 people that are part of the gallery, but also thinking about my work in terms of how it would be displayed in a commercial setting. What is actually something that could be commercially viable as opposed to something that I would have in a museum or in a nonprofit space. So it's been a bit of a learning curve. It's been very interesting. And to think about space in general, which is something that I obsess over in various media. So with, for example, the gallery space, how could that be a space that I could occupy when I'm having my show? And I'm going to be having a show there next November, a solo show. So I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about how to create wall works out of my textile prints that I manufacture and sell commercially to interior designers and to architects. So there's a kind of melding that's starting to happen that's interesting to me, and that is also going back to my Serbian roots, which is never far away from my thoughts or my activities. So there's a kind of interesting balance, and I would say that for the moment, the visual work is taking precedence over other things, but that could be changed at any time.
Of course, of course. Well, those pieces behind you are very interesting. Now, are those samples of your work, or
Those are all they're samples of textiles, and the ones that I have behind here are textiles for upholstery, and they're all very brightly colored, and they're ideally made for velvet. And so I've been working with various interior designers in New Mexico and in New York on specific projects. So they will have a client that needs a particular, let's say, sofa or a particular armchair that they would like to have covered in a material. So I'll work with them to customize a material that's not only a particular color, but also has a kind of feel that they're interested in, the types of patterns, the types of how busy do they want it or how not busy do they want it. I mean, they have a tendency to be very bold. And my taste for these kinds of things is very bold colors and very bold designs. And so those things now are transferring into the wall work. So they're all kind of feeding each other in an interesting way.
Well, I think those are interesting, and I mean, you're talking about how you could display your work in the gallery, but what would be wrong with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. And it would also, the nice thing is it would be tactile. So, people can touch them, which is also part of the experience with textiles. So
that's interesting that you would say that, because, people are always wanting to touch paintings because of the texture. And of course, you don't want them to touch them because you don't want them to leave fingerprints. We were in a gallery in San Francisco, and there was a huge painting there that I was interested in, and it was made out of the lint from vacuum cleaners.
Mm.
And the artist wanted it to be tactile. He wanted viewers to touch it. And I asked the young lady who was accompanying us on this in the gallery if I could touch it. She said, "No, you can't. It's worth $1 million." So I didn't touch it.
With
So
mine, I could put a little sign up, please touch.
yeah, exactly. So don't put that restriction on your textiles.
No.
No. Well, all right. From what I've read about you and your work, many of your projects are collaborations with your clients, as you just kind of explained the process there. Do you ever, are you creating with them, for them, or do you ever just create for yourself, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, the new wall works and the things that I'm going to be having at the gallery are definitely personal.
Okay.
They are for me, but at the same time, they have an eye towards commerce. And so there is that line. I mean, I think that I'm one of the few people that actually enjoy the melding of art and business. And so those works, even though they are personal works, in a lot of ways are also intended to be sold. I think that in a lot of ways, things that I do that are installation based are the most personal because they're not intended to be sold, but they are intended, the experience is intended to be shared with other people. So there is a kind of crossover. And in a lot of ways, I think artists always do this, that they want to, it's like a relationship with the viewer. So if the viewer is just the viewer, as a viewer is a customer or whatever it is, there is an unspoken relationship there that you want people to look at the work, to interact with it, to have some kind of a relationship, and to also bring their own history and their own narrative to whatever you're doing, yes. Which makes it really nice. I mean, when that actually happens, when you're able to trigger something in somebody else, that's when things, I think, get really interesting.
Yes. Well, let's go back a few years. And what motivated you to become creative?
I think I've probably always had that. I've had that as part of my DNA early on. My father was a physicist in Berkeley, and he was a very creative scientist, and he ended up doing work that was really groundbreaking in terms of environmental work. So he was the one that started the term black carbon and started talking about global warming when nobody else was talking about it in the 70s. So I always had this sense that I wanted to be in some kind of creative profession. And I didn't quite know what that would be. When I was growing up, I didn't know that much about art, but I knew about literature and I knew about classical music and in particular opera. So my first love was literature and writing. And when I was an undergrad at Berkeley, I first started studying English Lit. And then one of my friends told me, "Oh, there's this art history class. It's really cool. You should go into that class." And I knew nothing about art history. And so I thought, well, fill some credits. Why not? And I walked in there and it was being taught by an art historian named Svetlana Alpers, who's one of the experts on Netherlandish Dutch art. And she was fantastic. And I fell in love with art history. So then I became a dual art history and English Lit major. And from that point on, there was always this kind of interest between art and writing and art and literature. When I got my master's degree in art history, I started curating. So I was a curator in various museums in the San Francisco Bay Area for about 5 years. And I was very interested in the kind of collaborative process between the curator and the artist that I was working with. So that became an interesting back and forth. And then I decided I wanted to teach. So I went back to school and got my PhD at NYU and spent a number of years in New York and got to know a lot of artists and started thinking much more about the collaborative process and the creative process. So those things kind of all built upon each other.
Uh-huh.
And for the better part of 20, 25 years as an art historian, I was mostly focused on writing about art. And I sometimes did collaborative projects with artists, but my role in it was usually in kind of producing text or doing research, historical research on whatever project we were working on.
Sure.
So it wasn't until later that I started thinking more and more about that I really had a serious interest in interior design and a serious interest in fashion, which is a lifelong kind of obsession.
Sure.
And so when the opportunity came around to think about, what was my second act going to be, I thought, I think I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to go for becoming an artist and becoming a designer and becoming a business person, which I was always kind of had a knack for and an interest in. So I made the jump.
There you go.
And
Good for you.
I jumped 5 years ago and I haven't looked back.
That's great. Relatively speaking, you're a late bloomer as far as becoming a visual artist. Because so many artists will say as their part of their background, oh, I started drawing in elementary school or whatever, at a very young age, and that's great. But making a jump, like that, I commend you for that. I didn't make the jump till I worked in the corporate world for so many years, and then I made the jump probably almost 20 years ago to being an artist. So, but it's
So
great.
were you working as an artist while you were working in the corporate world, or it just came later?
It came later. Actually, I've been creating my whole life because I have a BA in vocal performance, and I wanted to be a professional singer, but that didn't work out. So I ended up working in corporate America, and you find that there are creative aspects of the business world, and but I really missed being creative, singing, and that kind of thing. And then I'd taken up painting in the 70s, and then I had to give it up because I didn't have time working in the corporate world and maintaining an art practice. So I had to give it up. So I didn't take it back up again until I think it was 2006 or 2007, somewhere along in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't looked back. So I know what you mean. I started painting landscapes and that kind of thing. Got terribly bored with it. So then I made the switch to abstracts, and I haven't switched since. So I love it. I love it. It's great.
Yeah, it's endlessly interesting, and the possibilities are, there is no boundary to the possibilities of what you can make.
Right.
And I think that's what makes it so exciting, and something that, every day you think about, well, which direction is this going to take today?
It's like there's an art teacher who is a psychologist. She has a doctor of psychology, and she teaches and she writes, and she calls it the adjacent possible, because you're going into the unknown. You never know. It's exploration and experimentation. And of course, I say those are themes in my art practice, my studio practice. So I love to experiment and find new things, new materials, and so forth, new techniques.
Well, there's something about that activity that is kind of at the root of creativity, letting things just happen.
Yes.
You can control a certain amount of things, but that element of chance that comes just through daily practice or doing something is really where these kind of golden nuggets come from, where you really have things that surprise you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, here's something that came out of this otherwise kind of loose play. But you do that every day, and things start to emerge and patterns start to emerge in
Yes.
terms of your style and things that you're interested in.
Yes, yes. You find your own voice,
You
so to speak.
absolutely,
So to speak.
absolutely.
Um, Using constraints. In other words, don't use every single color that you have available to use to paint. Constrain yourself. In other words, I've been using, and I this is not my idea, but from one of the teachers that I've been studying with, the Zorn Palette. Have you ever heard of the Zorn Palette?
I haven't.
You use 4 colors. You use cadmium red light, yellow ochre, black, and white. And you can get just so many colors with mixtures with those 4 colors. So you might try that in your fabrics, designing
Yeah.
fabrics.
I mean, I think any kind of delimitations, I think, are very good.
Yes,
And they get you thinking in ways that you wouldn't otherwise.
yes, exactly.
That's one of the nice things actually with working with clients, because they ask you for things that you wouldn't, if you were just doing things for yourself, think of.
Of course.
It's like, okay, how can I satisfy the client while remaining true to my own vision and my own style?
Yes, yes. By the way, for if there's any listeners listening, watching, whatever, I've opened the chat room section, the comments. If you want to make a comment, please do so, or ask a question. Ask a question of Anna or myself. So, anyway, Anna, are all your companies still active?
Yes, they are. And the 2 main ones that I work with are the textile design, and I have a perfumery business.
All right.
So
How do you pronounce the name of your textile design?
it's called Mala Igla, which means small needle in Serbian.
Okay. And the perfume company is?
Is Rock Realm.
Okay. I had that one right.
And
what does that mean?
It's just a kind of conflation of two different words, but one of them was room in German. When I started the company, I had been in a residency program in Berlin. And so I was thinking about how I could structure this into some kind of a business, and what am I going to name it? I mean, it's actually my favorite thing. It's naming things, because it goes back to the writing instinct. And so I came up with that because I liked the way it sounded more than anything.
I like the sound of it. It's fantastic. Now, do both of these companies come from your Serbian heritage?
The Mala Igla, the textile company, definitely comes from my Serbian heritage. I mean, it's something. My mother was a seamstress, and all of the women in my family, going back to my grandmother and great grandmother, were very involved with handiwork and embroidery and sewing. So that's something that I grew up with, and I kind of had it in my DNA, and something that I was interested in doing. So in general, my design practice and my art practice really feed off of my personal history and my personal heritage.
Sure.
Going back, I back and forth. I grew up in Belgrade in the 60s, and went back there in the 70s on family trips and things like that. And that heritage is something that I carry with me. So I really consider myself to be Serbian and American, and it's a balance between those two on a regular basis.
Now, is there a Serbian community in New York?
There is a pretty large Serbian community in New York and in New Jersey. Where I spent most of my time in the Bay Area, there was a huge Serbian community, because a lot of people ended up going to the Bay Area because they worked in tech. And so a lot of Serbian engineers moved to the Bay Area, especially after Yugoslavia disintegrated and starting in the early 90s. So they ended up moving to the Bay Area and working in tech companies or starting tech companies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So my parents knew a lot of Serbs, and I knew a lot of Serbs. And actually now I'm friends with the children of their friends. And my goddaughter, in fact, lives here in Greenwich, and she and I see each other pretty regularly.
Awesome. That's cool.
So there's a kind of, it goes down through the generations. And even if we don't have a lot of things in common in terms of our daily activities, we have that heritage in common. and we have an interest in our traditions and our food and
Oh,
you know
you,
stories.
yeah, you got ahead of me. I was going to ask, how about food? All right. Hey, I have to ask one question. Are you a tennis fan?
Not particularly, but I know what you're getting at. I know what you're getting at. Number one tennis player in the world.
Yes, yes.
Fantastic Serb. Absolutely.
He is. He is.
He is amazing.
We love watching him. We're tennis fans.
Yeah. He's amazing.
Yes, he definitely is. So. I'm reading my notes. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, out of all the places you've been, and you've been all over the world, and you've shown your work all over the world as well, and you've lived in a number of places, several of which that you've already mentioned. So, out of all those places, which is your favorite? And well, that's the question. Which is your favorite?
In the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
I think at this point, definitely between New Mexico and New York. And since I'm very much between those two places pretty much every other month, there's something about both of those places that I find really energizing and fascinating. New Mexico is incredibly beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
There's a serenity to it. The people have a certain attitude towards them that I find very, very kind of relaxing, and something that's connected in with their past and connected in with the history of the land. So I like living there quite a bit. My partner, Ron Hutt, and I live there together with our two cats. But I love New York, and New York in a lot of ways, coming back to New York was like picking up a thread that I had started in the late 80s when I was here as a student. And so I always wanted to go back to New York. I always wanted to have that part of me active. Right. And there's so much. I mean, the ability to go to the world's best museums whenever I want to is fantastic. And in a lot of ways, I was thinking about it the other day, it makes me remember, oh yes, I love art history. I love all of these, the history of it, the fantastic things that were produced from all over the world.
New York's energizing.
In terms of the States, definitely those two.
Yeah, New York's energizing.
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. And I enjoy the hustle. I enjoy that people hustle all the time, and I have that part of my personality that I like. So it gets fed by the environment.
Now, earlier you said that New York is actually coming back to becoming more normalized than it has been in the past couple of years. Does that mean you can get into restaurants now much easier?
Yes. So you can get into restaurants now as long as you've got your vaccine cards. Mm-hmm. You can get into restaurants. You can get into museums, stores. I mean, I haven't encountered anything that you couldn't get into as long as you had your vaccination cards. So every time I go to a museum now, there's slightly more and more people, which is good and bad.
Yes, yes.
During last year, during the pandemic, when the museums first opened up, it was a surreal experience to be able to go to the Metropolitan and be one of 10 people in there instead of hundreds or thousands. So there was something precious about that too. And that experience of being able to really be alone with work that you've seen, for decades, but able to see it by yourself without having all those people.
Do you still have to wear masks everywhere?
Yes. You still have to wear masks whenever you're inside. But at least now we can take the masks off when you're walking down the street, or when you're, sitting in a park or wherever you are. Yeah. And of course you take them off if you're sitting inside of a restaurant or outside eating. Yeah. So it's pretty close to being normal. But you wear the mask if you go on the subway, if you go on the trains or go on a bus. You always have to have them on, or in a cab or Uber or whatever.
Now, what part of the city do you live in?
I live in Westchester. I live in New Rochelle. So it is the first stop outside of Manhattan. and it's a 30-minute train ride to Grand Central.
That's
So when I was looking for a place, it's like, that's not bad. And it's a small city, so you get kind of, the calmness of it. I have a very nice loft that I found here that I would never be able to find in Manhattan. So it worked out really perfectly.
But now you said the first stop outside of Manhattan, is that going north?
North, so it's past the Bronx.
Okay. All right. Well, share your process. Well, no, let me back up. First of all, when you get ideas for perfume, how do you come up with scents?
It actually starts, we go back to that language thing, the writing thing. It starts with a name. So I'm a very voracious reader, and I read books, magazines, and I read the New York Times every day.
Wow.
And oftentimes the New York Times, and I like the paper version, I don't like the electronic version.
I understand that, yes.
There's something about it. And I have a morning ritual where I read the paper every morning. And I will be reading an article, and there'll be a couple of words in there that I think that would be a great title for a perfume.
Can you give us an example?
Let me think now. There was one comment in an article that said, I think it was about Fashion Week, and it was talking about something was startlingly chartreuse. And I thought, startling chartreuse, that's a nice title.
Awesome.
So chartreuse, I love that color. What would that smell like? So I start from the text, I start from the words, and then start to think about how this thing could actually, how would it smell? Well, it would smell kind of green, and maybe it would smell citrusy. So then I have a perfume organ in Santa Fe, which has about 300 materials. So I will just start experimenting. You have your little perfume strips. So I'll put the little paper strip into a bottle. That's, let's say I have one that I use all the time, which is called California Lemon. And it's a very kind of bright, yellowy smell. So you start with that and think about, what is it that could work well with that? Well, maybe something that has a kind of minty smell, or maybe something that, a bergamot smell, or any kind of other citrus. So you start building it that way. And it's not unlike composing. I mean, my partner is a music composer, so there's certain similarities. And even the language that's used for perfumery comes out of music. So you talk about notes, and you talk about, instead of talking about chords, we talk about accords, but and you talk about it as a composition. So the formula itself, which develops over weeks, months, sometimes years, is really this kind of give and take. What does it sound like? What does it smell like when you put these things together? So sometimes the formulas will have 10 different notes in it. Sometimes they'll have less, sometimes they'll have 30. So it all depends on how much of each do you want.
Now, is that an asset or not? Say, for instance, if you go to the perfume counter in a department store and you smell something, do you automatically know, okay, this is a combination of these scents? Or
I can identify the top, they're called the top notes. So I can identify the ones that will hit you right off the bat. The other things, if you're a good perfumer, are very hard to describe or figure out, because two things together can smell completely different than those things separated. So you could have two notes that when they merge together create this fantastic other scent, but you would never get that by smelling them separately. Mm-hmm. So that's why perfumers are really strict about keeping their formulas secret, because they don't want anybody to know all of these ingredients that are in there, because they're very precious.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which the whole process is very secretive. So you can have the basic things okay, it has this musky smell, or it has the citrus smell, or a floral, rose, whatever. But then the real artistry comes in the subtlety of it and how those little things are tweaked each time. And that really is the artistry of the perfumer.
Well, do you find that an advantage for you or a disadvantage?
It's something that I actually try. I try to limit the number of materials that I use, and then just think about the amount. Because if you use, let's say, 10 times as much rose as you do lemon, it will have a certain smell, or the opposite.
Right.
So I try to not have too many materials in each scent. And also they function in different ways. Each material has a different lasting quality. So some of them you can smell just for a few seconds and then they disappear. Other ones are much longer, so that you retain that smell. So sometimes you'll be walking down the hall and you can smell that somebody went past you and they kind of left their trace of a scent, for good or bad. So I think easily with perfumery, you can get lost in the number of materials that there are. You could just spend years and years just creating a single fragrance, which perfumers do. But since I have a lot of other interests and basically a very limited attention span, I think, I have a tendency to kind of control myself, because I think it leads to better work, and it leads to me not getting too frustrated with things.
Well, now does this sense of smell, does this transition to food as well?
Oh, yes. So I'm a big foodie. And and I love to travel. So that's the first thing that I'm always thinking of is where can I eat, and what are the best things I can eat in whatever place I'm going, and things that are unusual that, cuisines of different parts of the world that I can take little bits and pieces of. And then when I make something, I can add that in there. I spent quite a bit of time in the south of France when I was younger and when my daughter was younger. And that had a tremendous influence on both the perfumery and the cooking, because both of those things coming out of that part of the world are incredible. I mean, it's pretty hard to beat anywhere. So you have a sense in which all of it's connected. And I think that with COVID too, when they first started talking about it and they said you lose your sense of taste and smell, like how horrible is that?
Exactly. Yes.
How horrible would that be? And
Well,
to not have those senses.
Well, I lost my voice for after a surgery for at least 3 months, and I could only whisper. Now, tell me that that's frustrating as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
I had to have a procedure where they injected my vocal cord, my frozen vocal cord, to get it loosened up. But anyway, that's
So
beside the
do
point.
you still sing?
I haven't for a few years. I was in a local chorus, community chorus choir, and I love singing. And I had to quit because I had open heart surgery, and so I haven't gone back yet. But I would love to. I would love to compete on The Voice, but I don't think I can compete with those young people.
I dare you. I bet you could.
I might give it a try. You never know. Well, Anna, you've written a number of screenplays. Are any of these published where they can be read? Or?
Actually, one of them is now being turned into an animated short. So it's about halfway through, or let's say a third through the process. And it's one of these things that goes back. It goes back to my Serbian roots, but it also includes perfumery. And it's based on a true story. During World War II, the German occupation of Belgrade, and the shopkeepers were still supposed to open their shops for a certain number of hours every week. And so one of them was a perfumer that I actually met his son on a trip back there. And he told me this story about a German officer that came in and that traded a French typewriter that he had gotten from a battle in France for a bottle of perfume. And so the story was so weird and so interesting that I thought this would make a good little short.
So what's the title?
It's called The Typewriter.
The Typewriter.
And so I'm in the process of working with a Serbian animator, and she's doing the animation to the screenplay that I wrote. And my partner Ron is going to do the musical score.
Mhm.
So it's these three people kind of working on the project. So hopefully it'll be done by the deadline is kind of March, because I'm going to be going to do a project in Leipzig in Germany in April. So I'd like to be able to take that project and present it there at one of their art centers. So we'll see how it happens. I think it's probably gonna happen.
Well, you have to let us know.
I will. I will.
I would love to see it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a cool project. I've never made an animated film before, and it's very interesting. The process is very interesting working with this woman that's doing the graphics. So
Well,
it's
great
fun.
collaboration you've got going there with your partner, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I was also thinking, since it's basically a short about perfume, that I might as well at the screening have some sort of scent. So
Well,
it could be a scent. You know, they used to do those movies, the scented movies.
No pun there.
Do you remember those movies that they'd have, the Scentorama? They did them in Los Angeles, like in the early 70s.
I don't recall. But if it was the early 70s, I was in just totally different mindset. So.
It wasn't a success because it was very complicated. They tried to do the scents with each scene. So they had these pipes underneath the chairs that would spray different scents depending on what was going on in the film. So people complained that there was too many smells by the midpoint of the movie.
I can imagine, there are certain scents or strong scents that will give me an instant headache, and my wife as well. So
absolutely,
I don't appreciate those strong ones. So it's got to be subtle, more subtle. Well, tell us about. We're getting close to the finish line here, but tell us, if you can, quickly about the Capsule Collection.
So I started a couple of capsule collections, and one of them is I've been thinking about doing a small accessory line that would be growing out of the textile business. So something having to do with bracelets or necklaces, but made out of fabric or made out of some kind of synthetic material that could be laser cut. So I've started working with different designs to do that. And some of them, early ones, are based on embroideries that actually my great-grandmother did. So I have her embroideries. And so I was playing around digitally with using her patterns and then manipulating them in neoprene. So it's a synthetic, it's like what they use for scuba suits. And it's a nice material because it doesn't fray. So if you laser cut it, it's very clean. So they're almost like sculptural pieces, but for the neck or for, bracelets or however you wanted to wear them. So that's a really, it's just starting as a project, actually.
Yeah, I think I saw on your site that I saw somebody with a mask on that was.
Yeah, that's my partner. I asked him to model it for me.
Is that made out of fabric?
It is. It's made out of neoprene. Yeah, so we were actually, when COVID first hit and we were in lockdown in Santa Fe, I started working on these patterns, and I thought, well, what do I have? I have him and I have me to do the modeling here. So let's go out in the backyard, and he was a good sport to model it for me. So.
Well, I found that mask very interesting. You could almost feel the texture.
Yeah. And it's, it's a nice material because it's actually soft. I mean, it's quite pleasant to have, but it keeps a kind of sculptural look to it. It's very three-dimensional. So it's an interesting fabric to work with.
Well, wasn't there, I don't know how to describe it, but there's holes in this fabric.
There's holes, and I put in little. So one of the things I was thinking about during COVID is you got this mask on all the time. How to make it more pleasant. So I put these little tiny bottles with perfume that could be. You could choose what scent you wanted that day. You could attach it to your mask. So you could walk around with a personalized scent to make your quarantine life more pleasant.
That's very creative. That is very creative. I love it. Well, have you sold any of those?
No, they're still in prototype. They're still in
I
prototype.
see. I see. Well, they would probably be fairly expensive, would they not?
I think they would. Well, anytime you're doing these things bespoke or you're doing custom things, they're expensive because you're not having them mass produced.
Right.
So when you have to make them yourself, the cost goes up.
Yeah.
But they really become like wearable art at that point. So you could walk around with it, and
Yes.
it would make quarantine much more pleasant. If we get another quarantine, we can all start wearing the masks,
Well,
the neoprene.
heaven forbid. So I hope we don't have to have another quarantine.
Me too.
But I would love to wear one of those masks. However, I probably couldn't afford it. I need to sell a piece of art.
We can barter.
There
We
you
can
go.
barter.
There you go. If you like abstract, we definitely can barter.
Absolutely.
Good, good. Well, Anna, is there anything that you would like to leave the listeners with, or anything else that you would like to add?
Well, I would just like to encourage people that have some ideas about something that they want to do in the second act of their life, that they should just go for it. And life is short, and you should do as many things as you possibly can during your lifetime. And if there are things that people are interested in doing or started and then stopped because of various life issues, pick it up again and keep going and see where it takes you. I think it's tremendously fun, it's invigorating, and it keeps you going.
That's awesome. That's very good advice. I really like that. I've never had anybody say that before, but that is very good advice. So thank you for sharing that. And I want to thank you for being my guest today. And I definitely wish you the best with all of your many business endeavors. So
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
my pleasure as well. You're a very interesting person, and I'm glad to have you as my guest. So thank you. And
Thank
you have a
you.
good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, thank you for watching and listening, if you're still watching and listening, to The Artist's Voice. As stated at the beginning, video and audio recordings will soon be available. And please do not forget to make a donation to support The Artist's Voice. As I'm signing off, in addition to Anna's donation, I want to give a shout out to other donors on the Patreon page, which is Nini Humphrey, Art Acrobat, Anne Morgan Jesperson, and Katie Radney. Thank you all for your donations as well. And until the next episode, this is Jerry Hardesty signing off, and have a great weekend.